Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to talk about a variety of things today, but I want to start with this idea of someplace else. And it's not just that I would like to be somewhere else, which I would, and I think we all would. But for me, I have this really keen interest in how it is that place, where we are at any given time, kind of seeps into a way of thinking and making. And so that's really why I wanted to start with this image. But I think I should probably back up and say that I teach in the School of Photography. I'm not a photographer, but I am a maker. I'm primarily a sculptor and deal a lot with public space. But my practice in teaching really has to do with students who are involved in the process of making. So much of what I'm going to talk about has to do with this idea of how it is we think about making. I actually teach a class called Thinking About Making. But for me, I want to also really focus on this idea of what I teach, but why I teach. And why I teach is a really simple answer for me. It's this sense of curiosity, this sense that there is something out there that I still don't know, and that I want to try to figure this out. And questions, which is what I call this talk today, is really what I find to be the most interesting part of teaching, for me anyways. This idea of asking questions and discovering what the question to ask is clearly what the student kind of struggles with. And I guess that's what I feel my job is to help them figure out what those questions are. So for me, it's the reason why I am here. In really kind of this shared sense of learning and acquiring knowledge and seeking out what we don't already know. I'm really inspired by the ability or the desire to walk into a classroom and pose a question as much for myself as for my students. And I think that is this sense of curiosity that all of us really hold. Right? It's the reason that probably we're walking into the classroom. I currently teach in the graduate photo program here at RIT and CIAS. However, I spent the better part of my career teaching freshmen. Actually, the majority of my career teaching freshmen. And so I want to talk about that for a minute because I think that the freshman is a student that is incredibly unique. And they are a unique student because they're in transition. They're going from this place that was high school to this place that is something else, where they have these expectations and these ideas, but they don't know what it holds. As a teacher of the first year, what I've always found to be the key to my success is they don't actually know what they're supposed to be able to do. And so that is really been the success of my teaching with a first-year student. Because many of my colleagues would say, that project is crazy, they're never going to be able to do this. They don't know what they're supposed to be able to do. So therefore, you can give them a challenge. I think that they're really keen to take that on because they haven't formulated this idea of what they're supposed to be doing, which is the sophomore and the junior, which I don't teach. So I don't know, but that's a theory that I've heard. But they haven't formulated this yet, and so they'll take on a challenge. And I think that our role is to really encourage them, to provide a safety net, but not to tell them the answer. To guide them and to nurture them, but not to tell them what to do. So everybody here is really lucky that there were no marshmallows in the store. Because my first thought was to make you guys do the marshmallow challenge. And then I thought, whoa, what if you did a really bad job of it? Then I would have to explain it. I want to show this because for anyone here who has not taught a first-year student, in the former Foundations program, day 1, 15 minutes on, this is what they're doing. So they've heard the people's names in the room, and that's it. And then it's rock and roll. 20 strands of spaghetti, a marshmallow, a yard of string, a yard of tape, 18 minutes, make it stand up. And It looks really simple and it sounds maybe kind of unsophisticated. As you can see, it actually comes from Autodesk, came up with this. The marshmallow challenge is about the hidden assumption, and it's the hidden assumption that a marshmallow is this light, fluffy thing. So if I just like make this tower, stick it on top, good to go. It doesn't work that way. Statistics have shown that the kindergartner is far more successful. They actually get about 30 inches in height by average, and the business and design college student is average 20 inches. There's two things happening there. One, the assumption that I can just do something and then stick this marshmallow on it because it's lightweight. And two, this idea that, back to my freshman theory, but you kind of lose that when you come to college in some sense, that I can just like work with this and something will happen. And what begins to happen is the student is making an assumption about how they can put something together, and they're making these decisions without giving themselves enough time to what if. Whereas the kindergarten student, or the younger you are, they're like using the Lego theory, like let's just start and see what happens and evaluate, and when it falls over, then maybe I have to put it over here. For us in the Foundations program, there are lots of things that are coming out of this type of project as an outcome. Probably the very first thing is our ability to communicate. I mean, you're like working with 3 people, so you have to have an ability to say very quickly what it is you think about how something is going to operate. So this sense of communication is critically important. Of course, I was teaching 3-dimensional design, so the formal outcome is you understand straight away that without triangulation, nothing stands up. But these other things about assumptions, weight matters. In fact, if that fluffy marshmallow had a little bit of weight, it would make it a lot easier to stand up because you would have this sense of compression. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on here. But this is what we do day one, or what we did day one. I haven't been in that program in a few years. But I've always loved about teaching the first year that I didn't know exactly where something was going. And again, to kind of reflect on teaching, it's like that we have to have, I guess, I don't know, I have another word for it, maybe this sense of confidence, or that it's just okay that I don't exactly know where this is going to go or what it's going to look like. What I do know for a fact is the space between identifying the problem and the solution is going to render something of value. Something that the student doesn't already know, something's going to be discovered. So for me, it's always been about the journey. It's really about how the student goes from one place to another, that route of exploration, that path of discovery. It's about the process. And for me, it's the creative process. And where does an idea come from? And how do we, as teachers, really help the student to nurture their ideas to fruition? The stages of idea generation and development are critical. The initial idea that somebody's going to come up with, and including all of us in this room usually, is kind of the first thing that pops in your mind, right? And it's going through that process of ideation and generating possibilities, the asking the questions of what ifs, the putting together of dissimilar pieces of information, making connections. If I take this with this, what happens? That really allows the student to complete the cycle of solving a problem for themselves. And the creative process, as I said in the beginning, is fundamentally about asking questions. It's about staying curious. It's about seeking to unraveling something that you don't know. I tell my students all the time, you want to be the dog chasing a ball. I don't care if it goes out of sight, if it takes a right-hand turn. You never want to be the dog chasing his tail. There's something out there, and you have to just keep striving for it and not settle for just the spin cycle of copying your own self or just taking information and using what's given to you. Students need to understand or develop an awareness, I think the earlier the better, that critical making requires critical thinking, and thinking is driven by questions and curiosity. So the creative process keeps the student curious, and teaching the stages of the creative process early on instill in the student a desire to seek out information that they don't already know. It helps them to really develop a sense that you have to keep digging for something, and you cannot act on assumptions. You need to gather research. I'm a really firm believer that research should be hands-on whenever possible. And it's not just that I deal primarily with space, so I'm talking about like being on site, but hands-on to me can be like the actual physical book versus the web. So I think that for me, that's really what I want my students to believe, that there's something to be gained by doing this research, and they need to move away from assumptions. So really my point is just that we all jump to a first solution. It's the obvious solution. We all act on assumptions and make assumptions, and students really need to learn to recognize this and to question their own assumptions. I have a mantra that we make ideas and we don't make stuff. So what are we making and why? Can sound like a really easy question. I think it's a pretty hard question. I know it's a hard question for me, and it's a question that right now I'm going to walk out of this room and go to thesis defense for the graduate students that I've been working with, and they're really trying to answer that question. And it's a struggle. It's like, why am I making something, you know? But I think that if early on, as I say, we kind of learn these stages of the creative process, it can serve as a guide for students. It can help them. They can kind of fill in the blanks almost in that. So the very first thing is, what is the problem that we're either seeking or solving? And there's a difference between, and I know that everybody knows this, but in working with students, I find it really complicated sometimes. They feel like, okay, seeking and solving, you know, they're two really different things. Anyone can solve a problem given the parameters and the basic tools that are needed. It's learning to seek out that problem to solve that really turns the student into being their kind of unique, individual, creative thinker. And in the, you know, I mean, I work between two worlds, between the design world and the art world. And so I think that we can think about these problems as being big or small. So it's like, is it something personal? I have this hunch, and it's like some type of landscape image that I want to investigate. Or is it a world image or world problem where I might start with what are the parameters that a community sets out for me or the product needs sets out for me. But regardless, I need to define what it is I think I'm doing. What is my intent? You know, it's like my friend Karen here, who helps me with writing. You know, like I think that the creative, the steps of the creative process can be very much like just writing an outline. You know, there's really a close analogy there. And so I think that if a student can really identify that for themselves, well, then that's their first step. Because if you can't define the problem, you don't really know what you're doing. Though, I have to say, I actually believe that you can start the process of working, and then you kind of like are digging and you're unraveling, and it helps you to better define or to really find the nuance in what it is you're doing. Then research. As I said, ideas come from somewhere. So you have to do research. You have to gather resources, and whether it's from books and looking at images or being on site or using a product instead of just trying to design the product. You have to do all of that. I think all of us probably tell our students to be sponges, right? To absorb everything This is the one time I would say more is better. More in, you can synthesize it, and you have more information to work with. This will sound odd to most, but I really tell my students read. And I say that sounds odd because I'm teaching in a visual field, right? And so I'm always saying to my students, you need to read this. You need to read more. And they're like, no, I need to be like looking at things or making things. Ideas come from someplace. The written word is a really good way to get there. And so I think that especially in my program, that students need to be more willing to sit down and take the time to read. One of the things I do with the graduate students, I call it random research, how to find something you don't know. And we spend an evening in the library with the periodicals. Now, Kari Horowitz would tell you that I do this only because I'm selfish and I want all these periodicals to be used. So she's like, yeah, you came up with this just so that they get like some usage. But to look at a dozen periodicals that you don't normally look at, and unfortunately they don't normally look at any of them, so that gets them at least to the library. But to find something that interests you, right? And we don't necessarily know what that's going to be, but when we see it, we know it, right? And then to investigate that a little bit more. And I try to get the grad students in particular to really think about the fact that, yes, you have this pressure and you feel like, oh, I need to be in the studio working. But back to this idea that ideas come from someplace, you need to also be thinking. And that spending 2 hours a week reading is pretty valuable. And you don't know where you're going to find something that's a thread to pull. So if you don't give yourself that opportunity, all I can tell you is you're not going to find a thread. And you're going to be the dog chasing your tail. Brainstorming, I know we all do. I just wanted to make this point about that we think about brainstorming as something that happens in teams. But if you're working on a project by yourself, who's your team, right? So we're safe because in the age of the iPhone, you can talk to yourself and no one thinks you're crazy. So I really, really try to stress to the students, you need to talk out loud about your project with yourself. Because up here, you're just spinning the idea. You need, when words are out here and they linger, like when I say to you, this is the idea I have, I can like pull it back as I'm saying it, realizing, whoa, no, that's not exactly what I mean, or that's not how I thought about it. So it is really important for students to get comfortable brainstorming alone in an isolated environment. And I think even using stickies, doing all those things of mind maps and graphing that we do when we're working in teams of brainstorming. But when you're working on your own project, you need that information. I really firmly believe that. But then at some point, you have to start. You have to do something. You have to implement. I think one thing that we're all very, very good at is talking ourselves out of at least 50% of the ideas that we have. They never even leave the mind, much less leave the paper. They just don't happen. Because we need this way to get started. So if you want to do a really big painting of a tree, then just do it. Just do it. So you need to further develop, to prototype, to sketch, but you need to have something that's physically there to be able to analyze it. It has to exist. It can exist, is a moving image or some a media piece on a screen, but it needs to exist so that you can analyze what you've got. Richard Serra, the American sculptor, says work comes from work. So you got to keep working. And analyzing is an important part. Once you've got something, to be able to ask yourself the question, well, what if? What if this painting were 3 times bigger, and what if it were miniature? What if I made this out of plaster? Materials talk. What if I made this out of plaster versus making it out of plastic? Those two surfaces are completely different. The way that we read them from across the room. It's not going to speak the same, even if it's the exact same form. It's going to have a different take. And then you have to get feedback. And again, I'm working, as Josh is, with the graduate students right now, and they're in this process of a lot of feedback has come to them. And one of the things that is hard is that it comes from all over the place. But I've been talking to them about you have to acknowledge it. You can't not acknowledge it. If somebody thinks X about the work that you did, there's a reason they think that. So you have to reflect on it. What you do with it is something else. But you need to reflect on it. So your action, you can decide to take no action, but you really can't pretend that, well, they're crazy. Why did they see that? That's what they saw. So this idea of getting the feedback is really that important step before we move on to that final stage of finishing the work. So I think it's pretty clear that what I'm doing and what my colleagues, and there are some colleagues here, are doing in CIS is what we would refer to as engaged learning. And the classroom is our laboratory, and sometimes we need to move outside of that traditional classroom. The class that I teach that probably best expresses the process of seeing and thinking as the prelude to critical making would be my walking classes. And for the past 2 decades, I have taught walking in various forms. I have taught it as observational design in the first year program. I've taught it as design thinking in the business college. And I have taught it as standalone walking classes, which I refer to as walking as learning to see. This fall, I'm going to be teaching a new class, which is walking in collaboration with community, new perspectives on space and place. And it's a cross-disciplinary offering, so hopefully I'll get students from some different disciplines outside of my college. And the reason that that is important to me is that when you have these varied voices coming together from different disciplines, you have different ways of seeing. And then how is it that you bring those things together? So I'm going to be, that class is open up across the college. So I've been teaching this class, as I say, walking in different ways, and I've also been teaching it elsewhere. I've taught walking in Dessau, in Dubrovnik, in Istanbul, Malmo. It's always the same premise. It's always the idea that how it is you use locale as the space for learning. How is that particular place becomes the classroom. So it's a form of participatory learning that gets the student out of the classroom and into the world. And really the field research becomes the seminal process for learning to see, to experience, and to develop an awareness of place and its specificity. I am obviously a firm believer that observational skills are really an important part of any discipline. So it's a way to kind of have a research practice that allows us to see something on the ground. To walk through the terrain of the city is an opportunity to both experience our surroundings and observe them. Through the process of physical active walking, the place of the city reveals itself through chance encounters, overlooked spaces, and the unexpected. We walk, we experience the city with all of our senses. We drift, following sounds, smells, paths, people, and shadows. And walking through the city allows a particularly unique engagement with urban place. It cannot happen in a car. That's not possible. Earlier this spring, I spent 3 weeks in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, working with architecture students at the American University of Sharjah. And we've been working on a project called the Sharjah Walk for 3 years, and we have received funding for another year, so it seems that every year it just keeps going. The students that I work with there represent a really diverse range of population from across the Middle East, North Africa, South Asia. So each of them brings their own sets of associations to what is the city, what is that place. The Sharjah Walk begins in the historic heart of Sharjah. We walk a while, turn right, walk further, and change direction. We continue walking, and this time change direction and head towards something. We walk with a field notebook, mapping, taking note of that which we encounter with our senses. We walk for at least 1 hour, and we reverse path, returning to the point of our departure. We finish the walk as arbitrarily as we began. This merges the familiar with the unfamiliar. And this is the very first walk. And what I mean by the familiar and unfamiliar is we walk out and then we turn around. So I'm coming back the same way that I went. But what I experience coming back is not the same as what I experienced going. So this really kind of instantaneous ability for the student to understand in the physical act of walking on the ground at that time, wow, no, this is not the same. I didn't see that before. Or I didn't smell that before. Along the way, the students are documenting points of interest. They draw, they photograph, they write, they record, they make collages from things that they may pick up from the street as they're moving through the city. This documentation becomes the landmarks of their journey, providing a broader understanding of what is the place, what is the city, what is Sharjah. Days pass, and the students continue to walk. They need to observe a site more than one day of the week, and more than one time of day is really critical. And it's back to my whole thing about assumptions. If I try to design something having gone to a site once, I really don't know anything. So I need to be there as many times as possible, but really different times of the day, different days of the week. I have this theory that we can transform ourselves from being a tourist to a traveler if we spend more than 7 days someplace, right? So if I'm there more than one Tuesday, if I'm there the second Tuesday, I can start to form some opinions that aren't assumptions about a place. So time is important. Weeks pass, and now the students start to walk with a purpose, with a more developed understanding of place. They're seeking to discover leftover, loose spaces that have been unplanned for in the city environment. And we have this term in urban planning that they're the spaces left over in planning. I really think they're much more just like these leftover spaces, unconsidered spaces within the urban environment. Having an understanding of the context of space and place from prior walks to aid them, the student is better prepared for looking for what is the potential in a site. And what they're striving to do is define these in-between spaces that they can bring back into the urban fold. And they can bring back into the urban fold by incorporating the user. So they're going to make an intervention that is really about the pedestrian. It's about the user. So we're thinking about these spaces as we now have a lot more information. So this project in totality takes a month's time for the students. So through careful observation, they start to uncover things that would be unnoticed by the casual observer, by just somebody passing by. They're paying close attention to subtle details, quality of light, what the ground feels like, activity, inactivity. Perhaps they have the opportunity for chance encounters with a pedestrian, at which point they can actually have a conversation about what somebody's desires for a place might be. And all the time they're recording with all of their senses. I mean, one of the things that I really stress in this walking class and with working with the freshmen is that when we talk about seeing something, we have to move beyond this idea of seeing just as sight. Seeing is, what is the taste of the air? What did the air feel like? So seeing with all of your senses in the creative practice is really very important. So that's what they're up to. And as the person teaching the class, it would have been just as easy to send them to the vacant lot behind the Islamic Museum. I could have just said to all of the students, this is the site for intervention. It's a vacant lot, let's just work there. But so much more is gained in drifting through the city and allowing the student to really seek out a site that they think holds potential, that their research confirms that it holds potential, that they really think that they have some possibilities of how they can increase the user activity with this site and bring it back into the urban fold. And what this does is it puts the student in charge of setting their own criteria. And the only way they can set their own criteria is to ask questions. They're asking questions about what does the site hold? What can it hold? What is the activity or the non-activity? And honestly, the hardest part about doing this type of urban project is that sometimes after you analyze all of the information, you have to honestly say the site needs to be left as is. But the final solutions draw from direct experiential relationship to site and the context that surrounds it. So the solutions emerge out of curiosity that is nurtured by this process and complements traditional research. When experiential understanding precedes traditional research, particularly of place, it is more likely to inform the questions, and it will directly impact the research and ultimately the solutions. So it's been a pretty fabulous project for me, but I've been yakking here, so I'm going to tie this all up by talking about when I come back to Rochester and I come back to the classroom, it's still about the questions. And sometimes we don't know if we have posed a question that'll linger long enough to actually push a student further down their path. And then sometimes, out of the blue, you get an email. And this is the email that I received from a graduate student who left 5 years ago while I was sitting in my apartment in Sharjah. She was in an exhibition in Queens. The exhibition was titled, What Inspires Me? So sometimes you get this little note that reminds us that we all have some salt in the soup. And so I really want to end by saying that I think the primary characteristic of teaching is generosity. I have a few others, but generosity is what I think of the most. And I think that if we can think about, and I have some colleagues here, think about the fact that it is our student, not my student, and not your student, but that we all have some salt in the soup. And to bring this back to the beginning of my talk, your senior came from somewhere. I can guarantee you they came from the first year program. So you don't know what it is that was the class, the comment that someone made in the hallway, that was the thread that a student kept on pulling. So we are all here nurturing them together and working together. Thank you for drifting with me. And
because you've been doing it, and as you described it,
okay.
you're actually walking.
It is physical walking.
So when you walk, when you set out on the course, and you wander, and then you turn around and sort of reverse course, are you reversing back on the exact same path, or do you wander just the same, and then each successive walk, like back to the original?
Each walk, for the first couple of walks, all have, I call them scripts. So that very first one, you're walking out and walking back exactly on the same path. Subsequent walks would have scripts that might be more like to walk from the heart of Sharjah. I gave them a specific landmark within the heart of Sharjah towards the water, When you come to the water, you have no choice. You're at the corniche, you have to go left or right. Walk towards something that's red. Now, I can say that because I know the landscape enough, and I know that the dhows in the water, the type of boat that's in the water, that they're all like painted. It's very kind of a festive like pattern that's painted on them. So they're going to see red. They're going to see it on both directions. So then they can arbitrarily decide which way to go. And so the first couple of walks is really leading them towards some landmarks, so that the student is expanding out into the city, going beyond what we refer to as the heart of Sharjah to kind of the modern Sharjah beyond it, as their way to find this site that they want to work with. Then they spend about 10 days of walks that within their teams, they're working in teams of 3. They can do whatever they want. The real criteria at that point is all walks have to be a minimum of 2 hours. And I have to say that these students deserve an amazing amount of credit, because in March it's already 90 degrees. And they're out there, and there's no such thing as shade. So they're out there doing it. And then they start to develop their own scripts, but they have to kind of, maybe in the sense that you would even say like a film maybe, they have to kind of outline what their script for a walk is as they pretty much determine their neighborhood or what it is they're looking for. So sometimes it's not a specific part of the city, but they're interested in how, for those of you who may not really know much about the United Arab Emirates, there's the majority of the population is guest worker. And the guest worker population just very quickly is set up through a hierarchy of what their jobs might be. So there are different parts of the city where these kind of leftover spaces actually have a lot of temporary use. And if you go back to the space that I found behind the Islamic Museum, well, my first 3 visits, there were the 2 blankets and the big 5-gallon jug of, several jugs of water with sand. So because I do this kind of thing, I know that, okay, the blankets could have been abandoned, but the jugs of water with sand, they're actually here for a reason. So it took like to the 3rd or 4th visit before I found what was going on there. And so the only thing that was transportable was the tent that was being set up. And the tent was being set up for lunch. But then Friday evening prayer was also happening there, with a group of Afghani men in particular, Afghani and Pakistani, that were the construction workers for a hotel right next door. And so it was like really clear that this site needed to just be left, because the activities that were there, if we were to do something to the site, would call attention, right? So we couldn't do that part. But that type of thing would happen to the groups, to the student groups, and then they would have to be, okay, now I got to go find a new site, right? But they had all this additional information to kind of carry with them in the process.
Has this walking technique or process been used in science or engineering?
Has it been used in science or engineering?
Yeah,
I would have to say it's probably somewhat borrowed from kind of ethnographic studies in a way. You know, but is it used in science and engineering? I don't know about science, but I would have to hope in engineering. And I say hope because I teach these classes at Urban Studies, which has kind of become our contemporary term for urban planning, in urban studies programs and in architecture schools. And you know, the thing about trying to convince someone that that walking is a viable design research practice is I can be at my computer anywhere in the world and design your building for you based on assumptions, right? And we see those all over the world. You know, the buildings that were designed that way. And then we see the buildings that were designed because somebody sent a team of 10 people to spend a week or 3 weeks or 2 months there. And that building's completely different. So should be used more in engineering. In particular, I think that idea, because one of the things that we were talking about in Sharjah is in Dubai, this like road system that clearly no one was like thinking about. Let's just put it this way, no one was thinking about it. If there had been a little bit more investigation, it probably would be a little bit more fluid of a system than it is now.
In science, they use that quite a bit, but they go out into the woods.
Yeah.
So you find environments and
Yeah.
communities and ecosystems that you wouldn't naturally recognize unless you spent the kind of time that you
Exactly.
in the urban
Yeah.
environment. But that's all I think.
Yeah.
I remember doing it as a student in
Yeah.
biology class. I didn't go out and do that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So everybody should have some students that want to take my class then.
Can I ask you a question? What I'm curious about is with the freshmen, for example, and some of and all these students, they're all gaining this experience. They're all gaining this knowledge, and maybe to a certain extent.
I teach other things besides walking.
Yeah. But I mean, in all the classes,
Yeah.
And how do you? Is it just by asking them to examine what they're doing, or how do you kind of let them keep a lid on? Are you just doing this out of habit, or because you gained the experience, or are you staying fresh in how you're examining things? Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, eventually, when you're coming in, like you said, brand new freshmen with no anticipation or expectations, you're going. But eventually, you're starting to say, "This worked for me, so I want to keep doing this again and again and again." And where do you kind of draw that line? You know what I mean? Or don't you draw it at all?
Oh, I think you do. I think you do. And one of my colleagues who is not here today, Amos Scully, I taught with for a decade in foundations. And I think that on the ice and in the coffee shop and sitting on my deck, we would like develop projects, right? Like you can't keep doing the same thing because you can't keep doing the same thing. I think that it's really noticeable to the student when you keep doing the same thing. You can be doing something that's after the same thing, but you're not doing it the same way. And so that's how we would just like, come up with something new, another way of getting at a particular problem, or how do we break down barriers in communication? How do we get them to think about their research? I mean, I'll say the one thing that I never gave up, and that's just coming out of, urban studies, is I never gave up the scroll. I had this method of research for the freshmen that they used a roll of paper and not a notebook. And they began the roll of paper in the fall, and that freshman class goes for the full year. So in the spring, they could unroll it, and they could see how one project really led to the next, and they had this kind of fluid sense of research. So I will say that's something that I started teaching with and never abandoned, but I would say everything else,
Yeah, but
I went about in a different way after a while.
I don't mean necessarily for you as a teacher, but for
Yeah.
them as a student. How do you help them recognize when they're repeating something because it's comfortable, because it's worked, and they need to push themselves harder? You see what I'm saying? I mean, because I think when
Yeah.
you get to the junior year point,
Yeah.
they've developed now a set of security, like most people would. Okay, this worked. I can keep doing this. The teacher liked it. When I did it, blah 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 blah.
Right, but I think that our job is to not accept it.
Okay.
Our job is to not accept that, right? That you're doing the same thing. I mean, when I first began teaching, I always showed examples because I felt like, I have to convince this kid that, see, I know what I'm talking about. And eventually I came to realize, well, that's stupid. Because as soon as you show them an example, they can like fake their way through the process stuff and just go towards making it look like that. So I don't. And some colleagues ask me, well, then how do you get the student to do that? And you think, well, you know what? At some point, way, way, way back, the very first time I posed it as a problem, I couldn't have had anything to show them. So you can show them research ideas, right? Things that they can go after and investigate, but not like, okay, this is what it's going to look like. Yeah. But I think that back to your question, it really falls to us. It's like, well, no, you've been doing this. Like, how do we take this? And it's actually like what Sean Liu said, where I said to her, you got to come up with another way to address this same concern that you have. You cannot keep addressing it the same way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's the hardest thing, trying to not show examples and then having the frustration. I don't know what you want. Trying to, that's the balance that I know in my world.
And I think that what you want is a question that is always going to be there. And it falls again to us to be able to tell somebody how to do their research and what it is they're trying to solve, right? I think that one of the things that a student immediately recognizes is when they ask you, why are we doing this? And you can't really answer that question, right? So when I said that I might not know where something is going, I might not, but I actually know why I'm asking them to do it, you know? I mean, I'm not saying jump out a window for kicks. There's a reason I want you to jump out the window. And if I can't explain that, then there's a problem. So I think that the person, the faculty, teacher, whatever, needs to feel comfortable. And I guess it's back to besides generosity, I think passion. If you don't have passion for your discipline, it's a giveaway. The students know that. And the passion for your discipline comes from your ability to be able to explain it. You would understand what you're after, because this is something that you're really doing, and you know what you're doing. You just don't know where it's going, but you know what you're doing, right? So the student knows if there's a passion there. You know, your passion and curiosity, I think, is what also really kind of keeps the classroom curious, right? I would say you also need a sense of humor. That becomes very valuable.
I teach teachers. I'm a graduate instructor over at NTID. And I'm noticing that a lot of my teacher candidates are somewhat rigid in their thinking, somewhat conservative in their thinking about teaching. Watching your presentation today showed me a wide range of kind of open questions, looking at teaching as a human active inquiry. How do I convince my students who believe that teaching is one thing, can be some of these other things? They think teaching is synonymous with instruction, with like a DMV module, that you do this and this happens. How can I bring my students more toward walking and teaching?
I'm going to be honest, I think that's really tough, because I think that if somebody really believes that, I mean, that's why I made the comment that my colleagues from CIS, we're involved in engaged learning. I mean, that's become like the trend, but we've been doing it all along. That's what it is that we do. We were never a part of that trend, because it just is. And I think that really has become the hot button, because we realize that is a way to seriously have everybody involved in a conversation. So if somebody who's teaching really thinks that it's about, I don't know, just reading this topic and writing this paper, they're missing that space between. And that, I guess, would come to, this probably sounds a little harsh, but kind of, falls back to my sense that what makes a good teacher is somebody who's passionate about their discipline. Right? So that other thing that you kind of bring to the class. I teach seminars as well. I teach a graduate seminar, and I was talking the other day about this, that in the essays that the students have to write, the conclusion of the essay has to be a question. So they're writing a response essay to the 75 pages that they read for that week. Their conclusion to their essay has to be, what's the question that's left remaining from what you read? Because trust me, there is one. There's probably 20, but there's at least one. And I think that those are the types of things that get us away from, okay, it's the conclusion, that's the end of it. It's not the end of it. It's the beginning of it.
Do you find that you have to prime students for all this access now to maps and GPS and like knowing exactly where we are and our destination. And do you find that?
Yeah, I do. I talk about that a lot. I mean, I think that the GPS serves a great purpose when I want to go from here to there, but it eliminates the space between, right? So you don't, we have this saying that like in the suburbs, you don't know anything because you get in a car, right? But when you're in the city, you're walking, and so then you know something about place. Right? An analogy I do use with my students is the phone. When I call your landline, I say, hello, how are you? When I call your mobile phone, I say, where are you? Right? Now, the students don't use a landline, but they can immediately understand that spatial and kind of emotive sensory difference about, wow, okay. And I mean, we're in a visual practice, so this sense of observation is critical. I mean, it's really critical. And the problem is, I had an office mate who was here on a Fulbright, Judy DePledge, is graphic designer. And one day she turned from her desk and she was totally disgusted. And she looked at me and she said, the computer has stolen our eyes. And I really thought about that in relationship to the observation project, that it has. We scan information. And if we're going to be visual people and really involved in this visual form of communication, we cannot be a part of that world that is scanning information. We can't be one of those people on the street corner that saw the car accident and saw a red pickup truck, and there wasn't even a pickup truck. We have to see those details. And I do think that it is, especially in photography, it's very difficult. I mean, I feel like sometimes like preaching to convince them that observation is the key here. And
Let me give you a story about that, Rob.
huh?
Let me give you a story about that.
Okay.
So I teach 3D computer graphics for modeling. I want the students to go draw the scapula so they can model the scapula instead of relying on the damn internet, which they're constantly doing. So the students go upstairs, take their cell phone, take a picture of the scapula, and then come back down to the lab and do a drawing from the picture of the phone. Like, I gave you the time off from class to go actually visually see the thing you were going to do. But it's become so automatic that the visual information is so abundant and readily accessible. The idea of sitting and drawing is...
But, observation and drawing, I mean, well, drawing is observation. I mean, there's two things that you can't, there's no shortcut, right? You either do it and you spend the 5 hours standing on the street corner watching how the traffic flow works, or you don't. Because I can't do it on Google. Because when I'm on Google, I can't actually see in the peripheral what else is happening on that street corner, and then I'm making an assumption about how we should change the crosswalk. So I think that it has become, back to this thing about teaching. For us now, in 2017, I think that we as teachers are much more accountable to how it is we maybe forcefully push students. At some point they have to do it, and they have to move away from the computer. They have to move away from the phone. They have to really have that experience on the ground. And that's what I talk about with real hands-on research. It's like, give me the book, don't give me the website address. And for me, in my seminar class, web citations, I won't even take them. I'm sure you use them, that's fine, that's great, but I'm not interested in those. Give me some real ones. Right? Thank you for coming.